So today in class you should have received a foldable that we sort of put together like this. And underneath each of these flaps you should be able to open them up so that you can take notes underneath each one. What we're going to be talking about is sort of good decision making. So when should we choose to solve by graphing? When should we choose to use substitution? When should we choose to use elimination? And when should we choose, how do we choose those best methods? Let's start by just reviewing what each of these would look like. So, solving by graphing means if we open that flap up by itself. If the problem says solve the equations, the systems of equations by graphing, what that means is you want to graph these equations and see where they intersect. So to graph the first equation, which I'm going to make purple, you would graph by starting at the -2. You go up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, up 1 over 1, and I'm drawing in as many of these points as possible so that I can figure out where they meet accurately. Let me see if maybe turning off the light will help make this not quite so fuzzy. All right, so by drawing this line, now I'm going to graph the second equation, and graphing this second equation, I would start at the 7. I would go down 2, right 1, down 2, right 1, down 2, right 1. And I can see that one of my red dots landed directly on top of one of my purple dots. Now the place where those lines intersect is right here. So my solution would be the point 3, 1. Now let's review what it means to solve by substituting. So if you open up that flap, solving by substituting means that you're going to take the equation where one of the variables is by itself and plug it into the other equation and replace that variable. So when I do that, I would have 4x plus 2, and instead of the y, I would fill in 5x equals 7. Now 2 times 5x gives me 4x plus 10x equals 7. If I combine those two terms, I get 14x equals 7. And if I divide by 14, I solve and I get x is 1/2. Now to figure out the y, I'm going to take this answer, I'm going to plug it back into the original equation, and I'm going to plug it into the second equation this time because I can plug it into whichever one I want, and I'm going to find y. So the second equation says y equals 5 times 1/2 because x is 1/2, and 5 times 1/2 is 5/2. So my final answer here would be 1/2, 5/2. So that's what substitution looks like. Now let's review what it means to solve using elimination. So find the elimination flap and open it up. Solving using elimination means make one of these variables cancel. So I can see here that the y and the y are already set up for canceling. So I would get 2x equals 14. Then I would divide by 2, and I would get x equals 7. Once I know that x equals 7, I would take the 7 and plug it back into the original problem. So I would have 7 plus y equals 12. Then I would subtract the 7 on both sides, and I would get y equals 5, which means my final answer would be 7, 5. Those are our 3 options for solving. We can solve by graphing, we can solve using substitution, or we can solve using elimination. The question is, when should we choose which one? So the last thing we're going to talk about today is sort of how to make your life easier by choosing the best method possible that will solve the problem the fastest way. When should you choose substitution? Use this when one variable is already isolated. So here's what I mean by that. If you look back at our substitution flap, see how the y was already by itself in the second equation? That's a good time to use substitution. If nobody's by itself, substitution is a lot harder to achieve. Use elimination when all the variables are lined up. So if I look at my problem and I notice the x's are on top of the x's, the y's are on top of the y's, the numbers are on top of the numbers, the equals are on top of the equals, that's my clue that elimination is probably a good idea. Use graphing only when a graph is provided. Or both equations say y equals. So if both equations say y equals this, or if the directions say you must use a graph and I give you a graph paper to use, you should use graphing. Let's look at some examples. We're not going to actually solve these problems. We're just going to tell what method we would use if we did want to solve. In problem number 1, I notice that the d is already by itself in this equation. Because of that, one of the variables is already isolated, so I would use substitution to solve this problem. In problem number 2, I notice that all the variables are lined up. The x's are lined up, the y's are lined up, the equals are lined up, the numbers are lined up. So I would use elimination to solve this problem. And lastly, in number 3, both of the y's are by themselves. So if I was given this problem, I would probably use graphing to solve this because those would be pretty easy lines to graph because I could just use my slope and my y-intercept. All right, I hope this helps to sort out exactly what types of options we have and when we would choose those options. We will practice making these choices tomorrow in class. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.